I'm Nathan Desfontaines, Cybersecurity Manager at KPMG. And what we do is we assist our clients and organizations with their cybersecurity controls, vulnerability assessments, penetration testing, and anything that is posing a potential cybersecurity threat to that organization. We assist them with identifying those threats, remediating those threats, and ensuring that they minimize their risk exposure going forward. This debate between compliance and security has really been a challenging one. Compliance definitely at the foremost becomes a best practice and baseline for most organizations to ensure that they have the minimum controls. However, the true end to security will not be completed or achieved through compliance alone. So many organizations will start their cybersecurity agenda or roadmap strategy starting off with the cybersecurity compliance, and then from there start considering more hardened and secure controls to better bed down their environment and infrastructure against these types of. So biometric authentication has been an interesting one, since it started getting a lot of traction about 3 to 4 years ago. And the challenges with biometric is that no matter how it's used or implemented, inevitably it's going to convert to data. And that data can be subject to the same types of threats we see today with passwords. And what that means is that when a biometric mechanism is used, be it a fingerprint or retinal or facial recognition, that scan is going to convert into data, and then from that data can still be subject to a man-in-the-middle attack or interception. Once that's been captured, the attacker or fraudster may be able to replay that over and over, and the organization would have very little control over being able to change the algorithms to minimize that risk to you. So biometric hasn't yet been widely adopted by organizations purely because it hasn't mitigated that threat of man-in-the-middle and interception. So at this point, we've spent the last couple of years saying organizations need to be able to identify threats, and they need to be able to flag and see what are the threats that are happening to the organization. And the problem with this dilemma is that the identification of a threat within the organization is very reactive. So it means the threat's already been there, and we don't know how long it's been there for, and the risk that it's posed to the business is very hard to calculate. So that shift or paradigm is now becoming that organizations need to be able to either have some early detection mechanisms to quarantine or contain that threat very early in the threat life cycle, and further to that, they also need to be able to respond to that threat. So it's very well being able to identify that there is unusual traffic or risky traffic to the organization, but if the organization doesn't have the capability to be able to flag and respond and minimize that impact, avoid the impact from being too great to the organization, then there's very little that they're going to achieve by merely identifying the threat. Cloud computing has been an interesting debate as well, which is that the cloud has always proved to offer a service that is both going to provide you ease of access and accessibility around the world, as well as the service of looking after your data. And these types of promises that cloud computing organizations and providers are promising clients prove quite challenging, because it still boils down to the same thing, whether it's the organization or the cloud, and that is that the investment into cybersecurity needs to be there. And any organization that can promise 100% of security would be very difficult, and I don't think that it would be 100% possible to give that kind of assurance. However, cloud computing providers have proved highly beneficial for your small, medium enterprises because they are able to focus on their core business, which is protecting data and making data accessible, whereas small organizations may better use their budgets elsewhere as opposed to putting up their own data center. For large enterprises, cloud computing has proved beneficial in shifting over the responsibility of the looking after the data. However, the challenge has always been that you cannot shift the accountability entirely to the cloud computer. So the risk of that data being compromised or breached or intercepted by any form of malware or cyber attack is still going to lay with the consumer or the organization. So threat sharing and intel sharing amongst organizations is starting to become quite a hot topic at this point. And that is mainly because every organization in its silo is trying to address the threat of cybercrime. They're also trying to identify the risks to their organization and ensure that they implement reasonable plans to mitigate those risks. The issue then comes is that if we have a number of organizations experiencing the same kind of threats and risks to their organization, and there is no sharing of this information or intel amongst organizations, then we could better achieve a secure posture if that information sharing was happening. The challenge comes in. Who is it that is going to be mandated to be able to govern and look after this data? Who can we trust with our threat intelligence? Who can we trust with those risks that are impacting our environment? So the journey at this point is about identifying a body or framework that is able to be the custodian of this threat intelligence data, that has the right controls in place to be able to protect this data from cyber threats. As cyber criminals, if they were able to compromise this organization, then you can imagine that it wouldn't just be one organization's threats that are at risk. And then I guess lastly would be that once that intel has been gathered, who would be able to be privy to this information? Who can have access to it? And how do you convert threat data into intelligence to better protect consumers from being subject to the same risks that other organizations have had previously? At the moment, the top three trends that we're seeing is that we can accept that the Internet of Things is becoming quite a prevalent story and headline maker, which is that technologies are becoming more and more frequent. The rise of new technologies, wearable platforms, wearable devices, and the Internet of Things as a whole in the household as well as in the workplace. And what this is doing is that the technology is rising a whole lot faster than we're able to keep up with mitigating the threats that they may pose to an individual or an organization. So I would say the number one at this point is around, embrace new technologies, both within your environment and within your personal capacity, but ensure you are able to identify what the potential risks are that would be introduced by embracing these technologies. If we take an example, a smart TV within the home or within the boardroom, if compromised, would give an attacker access to both the webcam to be able to see what's happening in the surroundings, possibly a microphone, and these may pose risks to your privacy as well as to sensitive information. The second would be wearable devices. So if I can carry a watch or another form of wearable device with me that can be compromised, then we are introducing the same kind of risk. Someone may listen into those conversations, track GPS whereabouts, and this kind of intelligence is very useful for an attacker to further plan their next attack. So the second threat that we're seeing within organizations is the threat landscape that organizations are unable to identify who their threat actors are. And if an organization cannot understand who the threats are to their organization, be it hacktivism or nation states or script kiddies or organized cyber criminals or syndicates, then you are not going to be able to implement the right strategy or plan to be able to defend against these types of attacks. And if we're not defending against certain types of attacks, then really what we're doing is a broad brush stroke across the organization, which is going to make sure that everything is, mediocrely protected as opposed to something being very highly protected. And then the third would be the identification of what's critical to the organization. So an organization would need to spend some time identifying what are their information assets, what is critical to them, and focus their time and energy on protecting that first. And that ties into these threat actors, because if we can understand who the threat actors are and what the information is that we're trying to protect, then we can better embed the right controls to ensure that at least our critical information is protected. And then following that, embed hardening controls across the broader organization. So 2020 cybercrime is a scary thought, I think, for anyone. Given how, the rise of cybersecurity, cyber fraud, hacktivism has grown over the last 2 to 3 years, it is definitely quite scary to imagine what cybercrime is going to look like in 2020. What we can imagine is that given the rise of technology and the Internet of Things, and that technology is multiplying year on year, that the amount of threats that we'd be exposed to in 2020 is going to be drastically significant. So if organizations are not starting the journey now, which is already becoming later and later, then there's going to be a big wake-up call as we approach 2020. The types of attacks we can see in 2020 are going to be the attacks that are going to be more sophisticated, more targeted, and more personalized to organizations. If I can take phishing, for example, phishing was a broad stroke at many consumers and organizations to see how many they can hit and how many of these customers would respond to a phishing attack. Phishing today has become more targeted, personalized, leveraging networks like social media and social networking to be able to find out more about a consumer, to be able to structure a more targeted attack to them. And then to expand on that a bit more, whaling attacks within organizations, which are when CEOs and CFOs are being impersonated via their mail accounts to solicit payments from other members within the organization, is becoming more prevalent. And that's now in 2016. So we can imagine the sophistication and personalized nature of these types of attacks as we approach 2020 are become a lot more complicated, a lot harder to identify, and definitely a lot harder to remediate.